Here we are, so we can start. Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for joining us. And I want to thank the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine for supporting our project, Bordering, Rebordering, Debordering. And today we talk to Dr. Tobias Schank, who is a researcher in the BMBF project, linking borderlands, dynamics of cross-border peripheries, and he's at Saarland University, Germany. He has a PhD in English literature, and it's really interesting to talk about bordertexturing the German-Polish borderlands. So, Mr. Schank, the floor is yours. Thank you for participation in the project and for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these warm words of introduction, and thank you very much indeed for allowing me to speak and present my latest research on border textures and border texturing and borderlands films in such an esteemed circle of colleagues. In this presentation, I would like to introduce you to the concept of border texturing and how it can be productively applied to an analysis of border films, taking in considerations of film phenomenology. I will begin with a few remarks on film theory, and then lay out a couple of theoretical points on border texturing, stressing those elements of border texturing that are particularly relevant to my work, and finally illustrate those theoretical deliberations in a brief analysis of two select films dealing with the discursive complexity of the German-Polish borderlands, adding, if possible, a few remarks on how border texturing as a guiding research practice may also inform the collection, assessment, and visualization or presentation of data, as I will briefly illustrate with reference to the database on borderlands films that I'm compiling currently. Ultimately, my aim is to demonstrate that films can simultaneously function as objects of our research, so illustrating the idea of borders as textures, and agents in the decolonial project of border texturing, akin to our understanding of border texturing as a research practice that helps us unknow traditional epistemologies or forms of knowledge production, and simultaneously allows us to reimagine, rethink, reconceptualize borders and borderlands. But first, allow me a few remarks on film theory. In film criticism and feminist film theory, the principle has long prevailed that the meaning of a film was discernible only by such approaches that center the viewer's visual perception and cognitive reflection. From the earliest constructivists to the feminist critique of traditional gaze patterns launched by, among others, Laura Mulvey, critics and theorists have prioritized in their studies film's impact on and origin in the visual sense, not rarely to the exclusion of other sensual effects and bodily causes. Film theorist Laura U. Marx refers to this as the perceived imperialism of vision, and consequently postulates, and I quote, a turn to the non-visual senses, end quote, in order to investigate and best make sense of the complexities of film. In recent years, however, the apodictic character of this ocular-centric paradigm, or ocular-centrism, which describes this perceptual and epistemological bias in ranking vision over other senses, that is especially prevalent and dominant in Western cultures, has been called into question. For instance, phenomenological considerations like those laid out by Vivian Sobczak in her seminal Carnal Thoughts have offered a viable alternative to the canonically established critical investigation of film, arguing that, and I quote, "We do not experience any movie only through our eyes. We see and comprehend and feel films with our entire bodily being, informed by the full history and carnal knowledge of our acculturated sensorium." Proponents of film phenomenology suggest thinking a person's skin as a semantically productive surface, focusing on the lived body's essential implication in making meaning out of bodily sense, and arguing that the body constitutes an undisputable condition of the possibility of sensual and aesthetic experience. Corporeality, or the consciousness of it, allows audiences to empathize with projected sensations through a mutual sense of physicality that exceeds the merely visual and arguably precedes the cerebral. That, and I quote again from Vivian Sobczak, makes meaning before it makes conscious reflective thought. Crucially then, film phenomenology thus opens up ways to challenge the hitherto dominant hierarchical binary separation of or difference between bodies and images, or the real and its representation, mandated by the ocular-centric paradigm. Film phenomenology has the potential to investigate and illuminate the connection and continuity between audience and film, as well as the reciprocity and interdependence of bodies and images as we experience them through expressions of experience. This is interesting for at least two reasons. One, on an epistemological note, it decenters and destabilizes established colonial forms of reception and allows for alternative, experimental forms of knowledge production, which prioritize affect or association over cognition and reflection, for example. Two, on a more conceptual note, it centers the processual, fluctuating, ambivalent connection of representations and audience experience as a conduit to produce meaning. That is, it originates the production of meaning neither in the body inside nor the body outside the text, but in a dynamic quasi-corporeal space between cinema and the human sensorium that connects all the bodies in filmic experience, on screen and off. As leading theorist Vivian Sobczak concludes, meaning and where it is made does not have a discrete origin in either spectators' bodies or cinematic representation, but emerges in their conjunction. Why is this relevant to culture, border studies, and border texturing and an analysis of border films? Allow me to elaborate on some of the key tenets and mechanics of border texturing, which, to break it down, is a theoretical methodological tool which has been or is still being developed by a group of researchers from various fields, disciplines and institutions, subsumed under the name Working Group Border Textures. This is an interregional working group with the framework of the within the framework of the UniGR Center for Border Studies, which is the interdisciplinary center of expertise of the University of the Greater Region, comprising 6 universities from this border region, namely Kaiserslautern-Landau, Liège, Lorraine, Luxembourg, Saarland, and Trier. And as a recent addition to this circle of researchers, sort of naturally, it is my obligation to encourage you to follow our work on Twitter, which is why I provided this QR code for your convenience. Now, our work in this working group, as well as the idea of this theoretical methodological tool we refer to as border textures and border texturing, and I hope the difference between the two will become clearer as I go along, is predicated on the notion that borders are complex human constructions that comprise a plethora of dynamics and discourses, geopolitical, ethnic, gender-specific, historical, etc. The fact that those dynamics and discourses interact, how they connect, even if in contradiction, coexists with the fact that they divide. Consequently, we have recalibrated our scholarly focus from the border as a line that demarcates difference to the surrounding borderlands that form a zone of contact. This way, we believe that with border texturing, we can transcend the dualistic conceptualization of borders, which has become fossilized in many academic disciplines that deal with borders, in order to promote intercultural, international communication beyond the perpetuation of differences. Instead, with border texturing, we advocate a processual understanding of borders and their representations that emphasizes their hybrid nature, which interlaces spaces, cultures, people. Border texturing allows for and facilitates a deconstructive analysis of borders through the bodies that experience them, and through whose experiences those borders and the discourses that are invariably interwoven with them, like for instance, experiences of racism and sexism, become visible and re-experienceable. While border texturing is informed by several canonical texts of post-colonial theory and intersectional queer theory, especially Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands La Frontera has been a pivotal source of inspiration. For one thing, this concerns Anzaldua's aim to, and I quote, investigate the function of borders as spectacles of power and to understand borders as lines that both divide and connect. And I'm quoting from Hannah and Sheehan. This vein, Hannah and Sheehan explicate that Anzaldua applies her analysis to a broader conception of borders as the manifestation of binary epistemologies surrounding identity categories. Rejecting this binary thinking, she proposes the concept of a borderlands, where these borders are modeled and binaries break down. To that end, Anzaldua conceptualizes the Chicana body as a contested border and configures, and I quote from Moraga, a theory in the flesh. She considers the body as a site where borders and borderlands become visible and apprehensible as extraordinarily productive and meaningful loci of discourse that attract, possess, and exhibit a special aesthetics, an aesthetics that works predominantly through bodies and is thus properly re-experienceable and discernible, describable, primarily by such approaches that respect the centrality of corporeality. This is an impetus that border texturing shares and builds upon. Accordingly, Johann Szymanski and Stephen Wolfe remark, a border that is not sensed by someone or something is not a border. For another thing, border texturing, like Anzaldua, proposes to think borders and borderlands as sites of hybridization and cross-fertilization. As Cantu and Hurtado note in their introduction to the 25th anniversary edition of Borderlands La Frontera, Anzaldua argues that living in the borderlands creates a third space between cultures and social systems, a space in which antithetical elements mix, neither to obliterate each other nor to be subsumed by a larger whole, but rather to combine in unique and unexpected ways. The process of experiencing this third space, as Anzaldua notes herself, has been argued elsewhere by most prominently Homi K. Baba, reveals cultural hybridity, a notion that border texturing picks up as the tool intends to investigate third spaces that weave together hitherto disjointed spheres marked and marred by the primacy of difference. But put differently, in illuminating and unraveling the multitude of discourses that materialize in bodies as they experience the complexity of borders and borderlands, border texturing reveals borders and borderlands as configurations of separation as much as of connection, of normativization on the one hand and contingency on the other, of power and the possibility of contesting that power. Crucially, with border texturing, we propose to imagine the many discursive threads that converge in borderlands as a network or texture, which we are best advised to respect and sustain in our analysis of borderlands and borderland experiences if we are to do justice to the complexity and intricacy and interwovenness of those discourses. We can imagine these different discursive threads and the resulting texture as nodes in a rhizomatic structure, an anti-hierarchical structure which allows for different, diverging, even contradictory interpretational threads to, one, coexist, and two, speak to one another and produce meaning in their conjunction. As culture studies researchers, this makes such cultural artifacts that discuss or reveal borders as textures highly interesting. Naturally, this includes films that deal with borderlands discourses, of which there are many, both fiction and non-fiction. But even more interesting seems to be the idea of focusing on the process of cultural production of borders as textures through the exposure to, or rather engagement with, a film, the filmic experience, so to speak. That is, the process of revealing the interwovenness of discourses, the process of connecting seemingly disparate threads, the process of creating a border texture, of border texturing as a performative act through a person's individual, affective, as well as cognitive interaction with a film. This is why I have proposed to enhance a scholarly understanding of film with phenomenological considerations, because this way of thinking about filmic experiences allows us to consider films simultaneously as nodes or threads in a border texture and agents and actors in the process of border texturing. For their assemblage of material and arrangement of perspectives, all of which produces meaning in reciprocal exchange with its audience. In a word, making a film that quite conditionally conflates a number of perspectives and discourses that manifest themselves in borderlands creates a border texture. The resulting film being received by an audience, encouraging them to produce meaning about borderland discourses from the filmic experience, is a joint act of border texturing. Incidentally, as is the scholarly practice of rearranging, decoding, and reassembling individual threads. Consequently, film, audience, researcher, they're all nodes in a border texture as well as agents in the collaborative effort of border texturing. In the following, I will illustrate these theoretical points in a brief analysis of two films situated in the German-Polish borderlands. Grenzland, eine Reise by Andreas Vogt and Der Landrat und die lieben Nachbarn by Christian Fuchs. Both films are relatively unknown non-fiction films made during roughly the same time, the former in 1992 and the latter in 1993. And both films document the life experiences of several individuals across the German-Polish borderlands. Grenzland is a filmic travelogue down the border rivers Oder and Neiße, portraying the landscape and interviewing the people who inhabit it, inviting them to reflect upon the personal and structural changes they incurred as the contours of the nation states in this region were frequently redrawn in the course of the 20th century. Christian Fuchs's film, with the rather cumbersome full title Der Landrat und die lieben Nachbarn, Beobachtungen der deutsch-polnischen Grenze am Oderhaf, chronicles the efforts of recently appointed County Mayor Siegfried Wack, a politician for the CDU, who transferred and relocated from a small rural town in Saarland, so southwestern Germany, close to France, to the county of Ueckermünde near the Szczecin Lagoon shortly after the collapse of the GDR. Now, the German-Polish borderlands are a historically contested region. People and land have been shaped by a series of the most devastating, traumatizing, paradigm-shifting events, the Holocaust, World War II, and its aftermath. Especially the issue of flight and expulsion, the at times forced displacement of people as a consequence of international borders being redrawn after World War II, constitutes one such thread in the complex texture that makes up the region's transnational collective memory, with reference to Aleida Assmann. Crucially, films have played a significant part in the formation of this collective memory, both national and transnational. But especially in collective German memory, this issue has disproportionately eclipsed other World War II experiences with the often calculated intent to claim individual, personalized German victimhood in a discourse dominated by collective German guilt. To that point, Rebecca Grossmann has recently demonstrated in her study Moving Memories that filmic attempts to offset or square collective German guilt for the atrocities of World War II and the Holocaust with individual experiences of expulsion and forced migration have similarly dominated particularly German film history for decades. And while recently there have been examples of films approaching this sensitive topic from a transnational perspective, seeking to communicate between the competing pasts and memories of the many people affected, still, or again, films, fiction and non-fiction alike, are being produced that prioritize German victimhood to the often preposterous exclusion of arguably inseparable perspectives. Such fiction films, Grossman demonstrates, pursue strategies of renationalization through emotionalization and privatization of historical events, manipulating viewers to empathize with a supposedly authentic historical perspective, which is, however, colored by national stereotypes. Non-fiction films, of course, are no different. If anything, the ensuing distortion of historical complexity and concomitant cultural insensitivity perpetuated by these films is even more severe, seeing that the illusion of authenticity suggested to the viewer seems even more inviolable than with overtly fictionalized material due to the extensive use of archive footage, which more often than not lacks properly documented provenance, and the inclusion of eyewitness testimonials, which more often than not neglects potentially conflicting accounts. Especially with regards to the contested space of the former Eastern territories of Germany and the experiences of Germans who were expelled from these provinces, there is a long-standing tradition of uncritically nostalgic, glaringly reductive filmic interpretations of history, which, while ostensibly acknowledging the historical reality of these territories now belonging to Poland, all in one way or another cater to the interests and sentiments of German expellees to the blatant exclusion of a Polish perspective. Crucially, this strategy usually goes hand in glove with subtextual attempts to Germanize this part of Europe, regardless of political realities past and present. That is, these non-fiction films attempt to visualize and make re-experienceable the grave injustice done to German expellees who used to inhabit this space prior to 1945 by deterministically and vociferously declaring this region originally, legitimately Germanic. Presenting ample visual evidence, presenting ample visual examples from architecture, traditions, customs, and clothings, films such as Flucht und Vertreibung, Pommern wie es war, Schlesien wie es war, or more recent DVD productions like Schlesien und Riesengebirge, die deutsche Zeit, portray the great cultural diversity of these peripheral regions, primarily Pomerania and Silesia, harmoniously subordinated to a naturally embedded, subordinated to and naturally embedded in the German nation state. Clearly, such depictions draw on established tropes such as the idealization of the world and the spiritualization of the provinces, and surreptitiously continue the Nazis' blood and soil ideology. These films construct a direct, linear relation between provincial, regional cultural identity and the German nation state, a contradictory, somewhat paradoxical union distilled in the mercurial term Heimat, suggesting that since expellees were displaced from the latter, they were concomitantly robbed of the former. This implies that coherent German identity could only be restored by re-annexing the lost or robbed provinces on which such national identity had been predicated, a preposterous fantasy that films such as the aforementioned gratuitously and unapologetically indulge. Of course, such nationalistic rhetoric, and specifically these films attempt to ascertain beyond contention the naturally German origin of these provinces, simultaneously denying the hard ideological labor that has gone into their construction and conducting such labor, is inherently antithetical and invariably does not stand the test of cultural historical scrutiny. Rather, it seems that cultural identity in this region, as Grossman puts it, is inconceivable in terms of national borders, which is precisely one of the object lessons Grenzland and Der Landrat und die lieben Nachbarn uncover. Recognizing the intricacy of this discursive thread as well as the significance of it to a great number of people that comprise this region, both films pick up on the issue of flight and expulsion, Interestingly, and by great coincidence, by interviewing one and the same elderly couple, Irma and Willi Neumann, without knowledge of one another's project, as both filmmakers meanwhile have reassured me. Irma and Willi used to live in a small East German town on the shoreline of the Szczecin Lagoon, formerly known as Neuwarp. Today, however, the place is called Nowe Wapno and belongs to Poland. And the turmoil of World War II, they were forced to leave their home place and resettled in Gummersbach in Western Germany near Cologne. Irma, as she says in her own words, had to leave because she was deported in July 1946. Her husband, Willi, joined her when he returned 2 years later from Russia, where he had been held captive as a prisoner of war. Now being 1992 or 1993 respectively, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, and almost 50 years after they left Nowe Wapno, they traveled back to the shorelines of the Szczecin lagoons to see their Heimat again as homesick tourists. However, they make it a point not to travel to Nowe Wapno, which is now, after all, in Poland. Instead, they travel to Alfab, on the German shoreline opposite to their home place, where they park their camper van, pitch a tent, set a table, observe their former home place from the distance through binoculars, and bicker about how the Polish are supposedly letting down their former home and let it fall into disrepair. Incidentally, both films make it a point to capture this bizarre moment of entitlement, defiance, and national pride in a powerful attempt to interrogate and ambiguate the legitimacy and efficacy of the concept of the nation-state. Crucially, both films, each in their own way, go about this using certain aesthetic means, chief among them montage and camera positioning, to create a complex texture, asking the audience to latch on to individual discursive notes, to engage with the film and produce meaning, practicing border texturing. In these particular sequences, the ones dealing with the Neumanns and their experience of expulsion and flight, both films deploy the aesthetics of border texturing to challenge and reciprocally encourage us to challenge too the at the time dominant perspective of nationalist resentment expressed by the Neumanns, as I will now illustrate. In Grenzland, Vogt allows the Neumanns to speak their piece without interruption or commentary. He prompts them to answer perhaps uncomfortable questions, but the film itself does not explicitly or outrightly tell us, the audience, that their perspective is short-sighted and one-dimensional. Instead, the film intersperses their account with additional perspectives, including the perspective of the current residents of the Neumanns' former home, who reveal that they themselves had suffered from forced expulsion, as they originally hail from Slonim in today's Belarus, and were frequently equally forced to leave their home as a result of the Second World War. As such, the film eschews any commentary, explicit relativization or conjugation of the two testimonies. They speak for themselves and to us, who relate them to one another. This multi-perspectivity is key, as this texture of voices confronts and destabilizes the univocal and ubiquitous, hence hegemonic, nature of the Neumann's position. Moreover, Vogt poetically augments their testimonials with stunning vistas of the countryside and inserts of matching soundscapes. Crucially, the film's asynthetic, elliptic visuals have many blind spots, ironically concerning the most significant category the film is engendering in this sequence, space. In a context dominated by spatial belonging expressed in national terms, forever meandering around the question of who is entitled to the space across the river, Vogt refuses to explicate textually and visually spatial belonging in national terms. Quite the opposite, in denying us the object of the Neumanns' surveilling gazes, Grenzland masterfully ambiguates our conceptualization of space as something palpably fixed and inextricably tied to a sense of nationality. It dislocates space. Put differently, the film denies us reliable information on whether we are currently observing a sequence in or from Poland or in or from Germany. To the uninitiated, one shoreline looks just like the other. The river could be any river. The town could be any town. Germany and Poland look pretty much identical. We only know that the Neumanns know, but the film doesn't tell us what it is that they know. It does not tell us that we are in Altwarp looking across the Szczecin Lagoon at Neuwarp. We only see them and their binoculars, a perfect metaphor for their myopic, distorted, magnified views, looking somewhere that is of the uttermost importance to them, but somewhat elusive to us, because we do not know for sure what it is that they are looking at. Consequently, Grenzland unscribes the orientational propensities of the border in terms of the nation-state, obfuscating the riverine border, which vanishes as a natural spatial signifier of separation to most viewers. At the same time, its separating propensities resurface in the perceived realities of the film's protagonists, the Neumanns, in their paradoxical efforts to pierce through the border with their eyes and simultaneously reaffirm its impenetrability with their bodies. In other words, the film reveals, albeit subtly, that difference and dualisms, such as assuming an identity based on a sense of belonging to one nation or another, are elements of social construction, as is the territory that constitutes its basis. The land is indifferent to the nation that is constructed upon it. The landscape does not care for national signifiers, and yet its borders, themselves a construction, have a seemingly paralyzing hold on people like the Neumanns, impeding their movement for one reason or another. The Neumanns make the border, not the river. Through them, the river becomes visible and palpable as a border. In and of itself, the river is just part of the landscape. Grenzland therefore systematically irritates and undoes nationality as an identity establishing, organizing, ordering category, while stressing at the same time its normative and hegemonic grasp. It is the people that weave the border into the texture of this land. To briefly come to my second example, Christian Fuchs's film Der Landrat und die lieben Nachbarn. This film adds to this a more explicit challenge to the Neumanns' nationalist resentment, revealing their sense of entitlement as part and parcel of a deeply rooted hypocrisy and self-stylization. For instance, in one sequence, Irma Neumann gives a teary-eyed statement that their feeling of belonging is so strong she and her husband would walk home on foot if only they could, suggesting that they can't, which the film immediately meets with a jump cut insert of their car parked right in front of their former house as they pay a secretive visit to the current owners, suggesting that they can after all. In another example, adding a temporal layer to its border texture, the film confronts Irma's nostalgia with realism, juxtaposing her perusing of old photographs of their town hall with visual evidence that in fact it is no longer theirs, even though she still lays claim to it. But seeing that I should come to an end within the next 12 minutes or so, I unfortunately do not have the time to elaborate on the aesthetics of Der Landrat und die lieben Nachbarn any further. I raise this here to illustrate another facet of border texturing, which is border texturing as a research practice, and in particular, how it relates to another facet of my work, the compilation of a database comprising regional and industrial films from the Saarlohr-Lux region and the German-Polish borderlands. So far, I have illustrated in the example of one particular sequence in Grenzland, the artistic practice of representing the German-Polish borderlands as a rich discursive texture that defies national dualisms and simple binaries. In an exercise of symmetry of form and content, Grenzland weaves the discourse of flight and expulsion, itself a nuanced and multi-layered subject, into these borderlands and the people that inhabit them, joining, fusing, linking them with other discursive threads that equally characterize this region, creating a texture. Exposing oneself to the film and re-experiencing its complex weave, invoking the premises of film phenomenology, translates to a collaborative effort of meaning production, somewhere between film and audience, that engenders both as active practitioners of border texturing. Research, specifically within cultural studies with its understanding of assemblages and bricolages, may take this one step further and expand the border texture thus created by weaving different, additional, perhaps contradictory, perhaps complementing texts and context into the fabric. Consequently, relating the findings from an analysis of Der Landrat und die lieben Nachbarn in correspondence with Grenzland, or other films capturing the peculiarities of this border region and its people, like, for instance, the short film Process by Polish filmmaker Danuta Ferret from 1957, which incidentally features a very similar shot from Nowy Wapno's belfry overlooking the seaside town. It expands the texture and tightens the weave by allowing different artifacts to speak to one another. Assembling qualitative analyses or case studies, however you might want to call them, in and of itself creates a border texture, in this case, linking multiple perspectives and different discourses that suffuse the German-Polish borderlands, potentially expanding the texture even to another spatially disparate borderlands. For instance, the Saarlouis region, if we reverse engineer the filmmakers and his main protagonist's journey in Der Landrat und die lieben Nachbarn by Christian Fuchs. Moreover, and this is where I'll introduce the other related project I'm working on, this understanding of border texturing as a research practice extends to archivists' work and curational practices as well. So for a bit of background, as part of the project I'm working on, which is called Linking Borderlands, specifically the sub-project Hybrid Borderlands. And for those interested, I've provided another QR code here. I essentially do three things. I compile a database of regional and industrial films. I conduct qualitative research based on the films I compile, and I collaborate with archives and filmmakers to present select films to the public. And I will focus here in the following on the compilation element to illustrate one final aspect about border texturing. This database that I'm working on contains essentially a relatively big amount of data, or metadata to be precise, on regional and industrial films that in one way or another deal with the greater region and the German-Polish borderlands. Currently, this database comprises information to about 350 films, which includes an indexation that makes it possible for users to issue search queries that are specific to people, places, discursive nodes, and film aesthetical criteria. That is, to illustrate, this database, for instance, allows for a search query about films that either were made in or deal with or just capture the place, Nowy Wapno and Altwarp. So the place captured and covered in the two films I've discussed here, but also in many other films, as the table illustrates, by other filmmakers from different or similar times, stressing different or similar discursive threads and adhering to different or similar aesthetical considerations. Or a research query, a search query could ask for films about the coal mines of Lorraine. Alternatively, a search query could be about films that deal with flight, expulsion, forced labor, or forced migration, producing different results, this time specific to a discursive element, which might link spatially disparate borderlands, regions, and experiences across time, thereby producing, illustrating, visualizing data on filmic experiences that is simultaneously idiosyncratic to a specific place, person, or context, and universal to or at the very least representative of borderlands experiences. The result of any such search query creates and is simultaneously a component of an admittedly two-dimensional, but nevertheless complex texture of films and corresponding data that illustrates the complexity, multimodality, ambivalence, and interwovenness of borderlands and the discourses they touch on. This means that the database itself, as much as the people compiling and the people using it, are engines of the process or practice of border texturing. To conclude, I hope in this short talk I could pass on to you the inspiring prospects and perspectives that border texturing has to offer, which I encourage you to incorporate in your research if you should decide to pursue this avenue of research, especially if your academic field is open to the idea of inter and transdisciplinary work, or follows decolonial anti-hierarchical philosophy and deals in some shape or form with cultural artifacts, be it literature or, in my case, film. Because based on the premise that films too only ever make sense if they are received by an audience that engages with them, crucially, not only through their eyes or their brains, but also through their skin, etc. I've made the argument that such cultural artifacts work very similar to how people experience borders and borderlands, in that they make sense and allow others to re-experience that process of making sense only in reciprocal exchange with the people experiencing them. Border texturing, much like filmic practices, allows us to respect the sanctity of the subjective truths contained in such experiences, while opening up the possibility to project an even greater truth in relating several individual experiences to one another without assuming interpretational sovereignty over any single one of them. Instead, representing the texture itself, retaining the complexity and ambivalences and nuances of the many discourses that inform these experiences, constitutes the central goal of our research, or archival and curational practices for that matter. And with that, I would like to end my presentation and this talk here. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shang. First of all, unfortunately, I can't see the questions from our viewers, but as a rule, people watch the recording afterwards, especially now considering that the majority of them are at work. But, well, now, when both Germany and Poland are in European Union and the physical border itself is absent, is border somehow represented in modern films?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there's quite a number of contemporary films from both these regions, but even more than that, other border regions as well. Yes, it's a very contemporary issue, and a subject that I feel is a productive field in a way.
Okay, and is border associated with the past in these films, or not only?
Excuse me?
Is border associated only with the past, subjective or historical in these modern films, or it has wide coding system?
Well, there's different films. It's hard for me to generalize this, but of course there are films that, for instance, focus on a historical retracing of how borders came to be, how international borders shifted and varied in time. But of course, there are other films that kind of irritate this moment of like a linear chronological construction. Films are very variegated on like that. There's no singular answer that I can give you.
I understand it completely. Yeah, thank you. And thank you for your inspiring talk. And I think that each of us is even more interested in border studies now. And yeah, and I also want to thank German people and Germany itself for the constant help to Ukraine. And it's very important for us. And we can feel your support and we can see it, actually. So thank you. And looking forward to your colleagues' lectures. And it's not the it's not the end of our project, so we will continue. And thank you once more for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
And you, take care.
Thank you.